I personally did not live in St. George during those times. I was born in 1960. So, and my parents lived in Enterprise. My dad had graduated from medical school at the U of U, and he moved to Enterprise to he actually ran a blood drive down in St. George for a while. And then he was the only doctor in Enterprise I think he's the only doctor ever in Enterprise. And so, but we eventually moved from Enterprise when I was 4 because we had a lot of people that owed us a lot of potatoes. That was pretty much all there was to be paid in Enterprise. So, but my dad had been there through some of the testing and my mom, and so, but there, my mom's parents, Alma Nelson, and his wife is Althea Rose Nelson, and he ran they call it Nelson Supply, and it's hard for me because I never knew Nelson Supply run by my grandpa because he became so ill early in my life. I'm the youngest of 7 children, so I only knew my grandpa as the old guy in the back bedroom, you know, giving himself shots. Nelson Supply in my grandpa's day was more of a hardware store, and they did mining down there quite a bit, and so he had Geiger counters in the store. So I wasn't around during any of this, but when I was in college, I stayed with my grandmother through my high school years and a couple of years in college at Dixie. And my grandpa had long since died of leukemia. And I don't know how the subject came up, but I was talking to her about Irma Thomas and all the ruckus this would have been 1978 to 1982, you know, kind of the ruckus that she was raising about cancer survivors and the nuclear tests. And I asked her if she had ever, you know, experienced anything, and she started to open up and tell me a few things. And I was just amazed, and I was alarmed because of the things that she was telling me. The first of which was that my grandpa had Geiger counters that he sold for miners. And they were in the store and they were going off during the tests. And of course it would be, you know, seconds afterwards because of the wave waiting for it to reach there, but they would go off, and it was alarming a lot of the people in the store. So my grandpa had to find a place where he could put these Geiger counters to shut them up, because it was not an on-off switch. It just was a meter that would measure those rads. And as soon as it sensed rads, it went off. It didn't wait for you to turn it on. And so you can imagine what that does to customers in your store when rads are being recorded. So he found a friend of his who ran a bank, and I don't know if it was Zion's. I don't think Dixie State Bank was even around back then, but I didn't get the name of the bank. I just knew that it was a relative, I think one of the Snows, because my grandmother was a Snow. And so the Erastus Snow and EB Furniture Snow Company, Snow Furniture Company, and Snow's Cleaners were all her brothers. And so, but one of them was in banking, I believe, and he agreed to put the Geiger counters in the bank vault. And my eyes were just, you can imagine, as if learning about this for the first time, I was like, well, you need to say something. You need to step up. And I mean, that's huge, because that's definitive proof of the radiation that was reaching St. George. And she said, no, I'm not going to. And I said, why wouldn't you do that? And she said, because he was in charge of the bank and he would get in trouble for storing personal items of people, family members, in the bank vault. And I don't want to get him in trouble. And so that's the reason she never stepped forward. It was for fear of that happening. And I just thought that story needs to be told because that's pretty significant. And then as she told me other things, she said, I asked her if she ever felt anything herself, and she said that she remembered a couple of times being in her front yard, one particular time watering what we fondly call the naked ladies. It's a type of flower that has a long stalk and big flower on top, and I, as a teenager, I always liked the name for some reason. But she said, I was out watering the naked ladies, and I just felt a wave of tingling and prickly sensation all over my skin. And later that day, she said, I got kind of a red rash on my skin, and it was even under my clothes, so it wasn't sun-related. And she said that she always attributed that to the testing, and that she knew that it was during the time of the test, but she wasn't. It had become so commonplace. You know, at first, people would go up and watch the blasts up on the Black Hill and at the airport, what's now the old airport, and they would sit and watch those blasts. But she said now it had become so commonplace, people weren't even going up anymore. And so she didn't coordinate it with whether they had just had a test or not. She just knew that she had never had that sensation before. So in the end, you know, of course, a lot of those tests happened while my father was in Enterprise, and my grandparents lived there their whole life. My grandfather died of leukemia. He had sores all over his arms and scabs, and he would give himself pain shots. And my dad was a doctor, and so because they couldn't afford the medicine, my dad would leave the medicine there, and he would give himself the pain shots until the day that he died. And it created a lot of rift in our family because he was so sick. And I think a sister-in-law was a nurse, and so she felt that my dad was over-medicating him, and so those families didn't speak. I didn't know a lot of my cousins as a result of that. And you know, I don't base that on, I don't blame the people themselves. I blame this, you know, for not knowing my own family. We shouldn't have had to be fighting over whether my, you know, grandfather at a fairly young age was getting too much pain medication for the conditions he was subjected to as a result of all of that. The other thing that my grandmother told me that I thought was pretty significant was he was coming from Las Vegas, and I think he was picking up supplies for the store. And in those days we didn't have I-15, we had Highway 89 that went down through Santa Clara, through the Shivwitz Reservation, and up Utah Hill. And somewhere prior to Utah Hill on the way back, he said it was a really strange dust storm. And the reason he said it was strange was because the dust would go this way, and then all of a sudden it would turn and go back the other way, and then back the other way. And he just thought it was really strange. And when he got out of the dust storm and he got up the road, there was a roadblock, but they were set up to block the other way from people coming in. And they were really surprised that he was there. And they said, "What are you doing?" And he just said, "I'm coming from Las Vegas." And they said, "Well, you're not supposed to be here." And he knew nothing about it, and they said, I said, "Well, what did they do?" And she said, they dusted off his car. They had a tank of water, and they washed his car and dusted it off, and then sent him on his way. And I mean, that in my world is called negligence, you know, punitive even, you know, that people would subject their people to that. You know, we went in and killed Saddam Hussein for gassing 3,000 people of its own people. And here we were years before doing this to our own people. It's, and no name. You know, the name's been hidden. We don't know who the person is. But to me, it's the same behavior or worse. At least they don't suffer. You know, they were gassed and then they died same day. Here, people just suffered for years and years and years and still suffer. My dad, when he finished medical school, after we left Enterprise, we moved to Southern California. And my dad was an alcoholic, and so he struggled his whole life with that, and so we were separated off and on. But during one particular period, he had a very long period where he checked himself into the VA hospital, and he was at a 0.34 blood alcohol, still standing. And so he was really good at what he did. He had no shirt and no shoes, and he eventually was doing the physicals for entering patients so that he could earn $9 per physical from the VA. And then he would use that to take the bus down to St. George, and where he and my mom thought they were divorced through an error of a lawyer, but they actually were still married. And he eventually became the head of the substance abuse program at the VA hospital. And he would speak to incoming medical students about alcoholism, which was one of his dreams, was to try and get people to understand alcoholism. So he had a long period where he was sober and eventually ran the substance abuse program for the VA hospital. And it was during that time period that he got skin cancer, and he lost half of his ear. And I mention this because he was already very temperamental because of alcoholism. He was on edge. He was taking Antabuse every day for 15 years. And when I say taking Antabuse, putting it in his mouth and then sticking his tongue out and showing my mom that he had taken it every day for 15 years. And so when all of a sudden he goes through and loses part of his ear, is very emotionally upsetting, and contributed to him falling off the wagon after 15 years now. That particular event, after he lost his ear, when I say he fell off the wagon, he had retired from the VA hospital. He got the Heart and Hands Award, one of the only ones of any doctor ever at the VA hospital here in Salt Lake City. And when he retired, the church worked with him, and Von J. Featherstone was an apostle, and he set up what is now the program that the church uses for referring alcoholics for substance abuse. And my dad set up the pilot program for that. All of the first work, it was a 3-year mission. Well, he fell off the wagon 2 months at the end of that 3-year mission. Extremely humiliating, and to his family, but to him personally, to people that looked up to him. And it just was all of this, you know, and I'm not blaming his alcoholism on Downwinders, but when you add additional straws to the camel's back, and I just think him losing his ear was a big deal. He had started having, he called it pancreatitis. But as a doctor, and he would never go treat for it. He would treat himself. But the reason I believe he was treating himself was because he knew it wasn't just pancreatitis. I think he knew he had pancreatic cancer, and he didn't want anyone to know. And so when you put the ear and the pancreatitis into the equation, and then my parents ended up separating. And finally, I did their divorce. And it was all about him falling off the wagon, you know. You know, as a lawyer, it's really hard for me to understand a government that guinea pigs its people like that. And, you know, they set up a program, 50,000, and I'm just, as a lawyer, I'm telling you that's, you know, literally nuisance value of people for the suffering that I watched, you know, with my dad and my mom and my grandpa. My sister, who was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she's been treated and hopefully she's clear, but she lived there during the time she filed a claim as well. And so when I just look at all of these, they're like, well, you can file with the program, you know, and get $50,000. It's like, you do it, but it's pretty insulting for the things that we watched. And you can't pay for, there's not enough money to pay for the way people suffer, especially when I think of the thousands that something like that. And I just am always curious, who's the guy? Somewhere there's a guy who said, no, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. And, you know, very haphazard analysis that went into it. It's just really disappointing.